Taylor Elwood here, and as promised, I'm going live at 5:30 on the dot to answer your questions about spirits and about spirit work and spirit communication. And I got a few questions today early on, so I'm going to start out with those questions, and then as people join us live, they can ask questions. So I just saw Sheena and Jonathan join. Welcome. Thank you both. And so if you end up having questions, you are welcome to drop a message in the field here, and I will answer those questions about spirit work and spirit communication. This is a great opportunity to ask me these questions and get your questions answered. And I'm really thrilled and excited about doing this. And then toward the end, I'm going to talk a bit about my upcoming class, Advanced Spirit Communication, which is starting in 2 weeks. So I actually got the first question already, and it was a question actually that Jonathan, I believe, asked me earlier. So I'm just going to pull it up here real quick on here from where he had it. He had asked me if, let me see if I can find it here real quick. Yes, the problem, you got to scroll through a conversation that you have with somebody. He asked me if spirits ever reached out to me in dreams from time to time. And so I have in the past, I have done some spirit work with spirits in dreams, where what I've done is I've done some purposeful dream incubation. And what that means is that I will go ahead and create a virtual environment in like ahead of time as I'm going to sleep, like a temple space. And what will end up happening is I will invite the spirit in to visit with me in my dream. And so this is a very purposeful thing as opposed to just having a spirit randomly wander into my dreams. I will note that in general, I'm very protective about my dreams. I keep my dreamscape clean and clear. And actually right now, I actually have my dreamscape set up where I am meeting with my beloved and magical partner every night in the dreamscape, and we end up doing magical work together there. And that's one of the ways that we connect, where we have a long distance relationship. So that's one of the ways that we connect every day. And that has its own interesting applications to spirit work, which I'll get into in a little bit here. But I don't have I never have it set up so that like a spirit could just wander into my dream. I would have to invite the spirit into my dreams. And the reason I do that is really because I don't want people being able to just come in, or magicians or spirits or anything like that, come into my dreams. I'm very protective of my space in all levels. Jonathan, I just saw that you asked the temple space in the dream. Yep. If you are familiar with the idea of creating like a memory mansion, there's some really good books like The Art of Memory by Francis Yates, where they talk about like memory temples and memory mansions and things like that. You can actually create your own dedicated space in your dreams for that purpose. It's also talked about in Tibetan yoga practices and Tibetan like dream shamanic practices, and I have a lot of experience with those as well. And so what you do is you create a very purposeful space that is oriented around a centralized symbol or sigil, and that centralized symbol is used to focus and direct kind of the consciousness. And then what you can do is you can put into that environment specific symbols that represent other things that you want to explore. Now, this can be done both in waking and in dream, but for the purposes of dream incubation, what we're really doing is we're setting up a very specific space. And then what I might do is I might call in the spirit using a sigil or a symbol or something else along those lines that allows me to connect with the spirit. And then I can work with the spirit in that dream space. So that's my approach to doing dream work with spirits. And actually, we'll go into a lot more detail about that in the Advanced Spirit Communication class, because one of the practices that I'm going to have participants do is an actual dream practice throughout the 6 weeks that we're working together. So Jonathan, thank you for that question, and thank you for the follow-up question here. I'm going to invite those of you who are live here with me, and I just saw that Lee joined. Hello, Lee. I'm going to invite you to continue to ask questions. I will be answering some other questions as well that I have ahead of time. So I'm going to go ahead and answer one of those questions, but if you think of a question, feel free to write a message down, and I'm more than happy to answer it. I'm going to stay on here for as long as there are questions. So if people ask questions, I could be on here for quite a little while here. But I want to do that because I want to make sure that I answer your questions and also make sure that you know more about like what it is that spirit work is about. So one of the questions I got asked, and it was kind of like a basic. It seemed like a basic question, but it really wasn't. It's a really good question. Is you talk about different types of spirits, like elemental and nature spirits, or jinn, or angels, or daemons, or planetary spirits, or deities, or egregores and magical spirits. But what are spirits, and why are there different types of spirits? And I think that's a really good question to ask. I write about this a lot in my Walking with Spirits series, which I also highly recommend checking out. But really what it boils down to is, in one sense, what we're doing is we are, in a very real sense, we're dealing with the human need to categorize spirits in a certain way. Now, I just saw another question here from Jonathan. How do we create this boundary again to keep spirits out or in? I'll get to that question in a little bit. Let me answer this first one. So what ends up happening with spirits is we have this there is kind of this categorization of spirits. And in one sense, it's a very convenient way for humans to categorize and understand spirits. In another sense, what we're really dealing with is a cultural background as well. Different cultures, different spiritual traditions are going to have encounters with spirits, and they're going to name those spirits within the specification of the culture. So for example, if I talk about nature spirits, on the one hand, we could be talking about like the fairy or the Daemonine Shi in like Celtic mythology, or we could be talking about the Tengu in Japanese mythology. If we go and explore other cultures, they're going to have their own names and versions of nature spirits. And I want to be very clear that I'm not trying to homogenize the spirit, the identity of spirits, or the cultural experiences by just saying, oh, they're all lumped into nature spirits. That's kind of a convenient overarching category that explains a type of spirit. And again, there is some latitude with all of this. If we talk about elemental spirits, typically what we're referring to is earth, air, fire, water, spirit, or space in the case of Dojin, or we might be talking about metal and fire and water and wood and earth in Taoist approaches to elemental magic. Although with Taoism, they're usually talking about it from the perspective of the way ki moves, so the way the energy moves. So if I twist my arm, for example, like if I'm wrapping my arm around somebody and I'm twisting it in order to use a martial arts move on them, that would be an example of like metal energy. Whereas if I'm going like a straight, like a growing punch, it could be fire punch or a wood punch. Water's going to be tend to flow, and earth encapsulates. With the classic elements, we have earth, air, fire, water, spirit. We're usually referring to the building blocks of the universe. I have my own take on elemental magic, which I'll get into a little bit more down the line here. But basically, you have those types of spirits. Then you have like demonic spirits, spirits of wisdom. You have angelic spirits, which are usually spirits of function. You have the planetary spirits, which are associated with the specific planets and kind of the life force of those planets and the attributes that have been applied to those planets. And I mean, we could even go and we could say we have the spirits of the stars. We have deities. And we have egregores and magical entities, basically created entities by human beings that have been created for specific forms and purposes. That's a basic breakdown of the different types of spirits. And the categorization makes it a little bit easier to understand what type of spirit we're working with. It's kind of interesting because today in the Magical Experiments Facebook group, I had someone come in and they were asking about like working with egregores and tulpas, and they were talking about the idea of working with Papa Legba as an egregore and a tulpa. And I said that doesn't really make sense because Papa Legba is actually a Loa, aka a deity. And we kind of unpacked what that person actually meant. What they were essentially doing was creating an entity that was based off of the idea of Papa Legba and had specific purposes around crossroads and gatekeeping and things like that. You can kind of see here, just even by that answer, as complicated as it might sound, just how convoluted spirit work can be. Now, fortunately, in advanced spirit communication, one of the things that I do is I break this down so that people get to learn about the different types of spirits. And one of the ways that we do this is each week we work with a different type of spirit. The reason I've set it up that way in the cohort is to make it easier to actually, one, develop a relationship with each type of spirit, but two, to get some real experience working with the different types of spirits. And some people only want to work with like one kind of spirit. Like they might be like, oh, I only want to work with angelic. And the reason I have people work with multiple types of spirits is to understand the relationship and the reason you would want to work with a different type of spirit and how you work with those spirits. So I think that's a really important thing. And Jonathan, you asked, how do we create this boundary again to keep spirits out or in? I'm assuming you're referring to the dream. Well, here's the thing. The way that I set up my dream practice is essentially it's more of like it's more to just keep people out in general. I don't necessarily want just anybody wandering into my dream space. In many years past, I had an ex-lover, a psychic vampire actually, who was really adept at doing that kind of practice, and so I ended up developing some of these psychic safeguards, if you will, in order to keep that person out, because I really didn't want to have to deal with her particular abilities or anything that she might be trying to do. So how do you create that? Well, we're not really getting into that within this specific class. I mean, I'll talk about it a little bit in advanced spirit communication, but essentially what you're doing is you are creating a kind of like an energetic wall, if you will. That's the best way I can liken it or explain it. And it's this very specific boundary that I've set up. And actually, here's what I'll share is I have a practice that I do called Sphere of Art that I do every day. And this is a practice where I create a very specific space and a very specific time. And I bring into that space and time like what I want in that space, like what is allowed within both my home, myself, my kind of the overall magical space. And that serves as a barrier toward keeping anything else out, because anything else that is not supposed to be in that space is excluded. So if you look at any magical practice where there's some kind of practice around like creating a magical space, that's essentially where you're getting to create that barrier. So for example, some people will do the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram. Not really my favorite, but I mean, I get it. That's what some people do. Other people might cast a magical circle, something else along those lines. What I do is I do this work every single day. And the idea really is around inviting in specific types of energy, specific types of people, etc. So for example, my magical partner, that person is always going to be invited in because that's somebody I want to be in with. There's another interesting aspect to this though as well. And it's it's the practice of what I'll call mutuality. And there's a group called the Evolutionary Collective that ends up talking about mutuality quite a bit. They're not talking about it necessarily from a magical perspective, although there is some interesting psychic phenomena that occurs within that specific group. But the idea is really that, like, if I'm meeting with somebody in mutuality, I'm meeting to connect with their origination point, and they're connecting with my origination point, and we're essentially blending our consciousness together. That in and of itself forms a barrier of sorts when it comes to anything that is not within that mutuality. So if there was somebody who was trying to join in that was not part of that mutuality and was not necessarily invited in per se, it would be a lot harder for them to get in. And that can form its own natural barrier of sorts to this kind of work. If I don't want somebody to be, if I don't want to be in with somebody, and this is a good way to kind of even look at relationships. If you're in a relationship where your foot's already out the door, you're not really fully in with that person. If you're fully in, it means that you're fully turning toward that person. You're connected with them no matter what happens, and you're working through it. Again, just something kind of an interesting aside. I do go on these tangents on occasion. So again, I want to thank the three of you who are on here for watching this. And if you have further questions, please ask. I have a couple more questions that I'm going to be answering regardless. But if you have any, again, I want to encourage you to drop them in. One of the reasons I'm doing this particular live broadcast, one, because I'm doing live broadcasts in general with Substack and just exploring it and learning how to use it more. But one of the reasons I'm doing it as well is to encourage an overall opportunity to connect with me live each week for something like this, and just being able to connect and talk and have communication around stuff that's of interest to you around magic. All right, so, okay, so Jonathan, you're mentioning that it's usually deities and demons that visit you. So, I mean, what I would kind of look at in your particular case is, how much of that is, what are you doing to kind of set up your psychic and spiritual environment so that you're either welcoming that in, or you may just not even necessarily be doing the work to fully kind of close off and decide like what belongs within and what belongs without. And that's where something like the Sphere of Art practice would come in handy for you, or a similar practice along those lines. So do you have a dedicated daily practice that you're doing where you're setting up a very specific and intentional space and time that carries you through the day? And that's something I advocate doing that a lot of magicians don't do. But I do recommend it. We want to be, I find it important as a way of kind of doing magic every single day. I will add that, like, in terms of just the class that I teach, I don't teach the Sphere of Art practice. It's not a practice that I have permission to teach. I learned it from someone else. I can certainly point you to books, but what I do end up doing is basically structuring a lot of the work around creating a very specific space in which you interact with these spirits. So that's something to keep in mind. Now make sure too that if you get a chance, heart this live broadcast, please, and of course share it. So I answered I think I answered earlier the question of kind of like why spirits are categorized a certain way. Now, one of the things I talked about briefly also was elemental spirits, and I said that I had my own system of elemental spirits. And what I mean by that is that I don't just work with the classic 5 elemental spirits of earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. I end up working with other elements. And the way that I look at spirits is okay, so Jonathan, I see you commented again. You said, not so much. I'm open to nearly anything visiting me, although I've had some nasty spirits visit me, but they usually go away if I will them to. Okay, well, that's good. And I would probably suggest doing some kind of dedicated practice where you're purposely setting up that space each and every day, and that what you're inviting in are the spirits you actually want to work with. So that way you don't even have to deal with dealing with nasty spirits that you have to will away, because you've already set up a space that essentially says, here's what's allowed within and here's what's kept without. And I will say that, like in my particular case, I do have demonic spirits. I have some angelic spirits that I work with. I have some deities, and of course, elemental spirits and all the rest. And I have all of those in this container that I create each day. But they're all spirits that I've built a collaborative relationship with. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So elemental spirits, I was talking about that. So my approach to elemental magic is that, there's earth, air, fire, water, and spirit, but then there are other elements as well. And the way that I look at an element is that an element not only is an essential building block for life, but it is something that essentially moves the primal stuff of the universe. So for example, right now, you can hear me talking to you, and you can see like the light of this display from the phone that you're watching on, or if you're watching on your computer. Light is a elemental force, so is shadow or darkness. And then there's sound, there's vibration, because you can hear my voice right now. So vibration is another aspect of this that is alive and powerful and present as an elemental force. I even see love as an elemental force. I mean, love will get you to do all kinds of crazy, wacky things. Sometimes for the right reasons, and sometimes maybe not so much, depending on who the person is that you're dealing with. Like, I mean, love, for example, will get someone to drive 10 hours to be with somebody that they love and care about, because that person is so dear to them that they would do anything to be with that person, as an example. If that's not an elemental energy, I don't know what is. So that's an example right there of of an element, that love could be an element. Emptiness can be an element. Movement and stillness can be elements. These are elements that I've worked with over the years. And in the advanced spirit communication class, I'm going to actually be talking about how to create a relationship outside of just the 5 classic elements. So if you're somebody who's just worked with 5 classic elements and you're watching this and you're like, that sounds kind of interesting, you'll definitely want to check that out, because it is a different approach to elemental magic and a different way of thinking of things. So I talked a bit about building collaborative relationships in response to Jonathan. And again, I want to encourage Lee, Sheena, if either of you have questions, feel free to drop them in. And of course, if we have anyone else join us live, I'll encourage them as well. But, and I must say too, thank you all for being here and being live. This is really awesome. I'm really enjoying this with Substack. It's a lot of fun. So when I talk about collaborative relationships, what I'm really talking about is this. In classic spirit work, what we end up having is a lot of modalities where it's kind of like, hey, you're going to do, you're going to call the spirit up, and you're going to command the spirit to do something for you and send it out into the world. And if the spirit doesn't do what you want it to do, then you'll bring other spirits in and coerce it. Or you might bring those other spirits in at the beginning and then call the other spirit in and then basically coerce those spirits. That's not the way I approach spirit work. I believe in creating a collaborative relationship, one where there is a mutual benefit between me and the spirit that I work with. And in fact, there's just a genuine relationship. And so one of the things that one of the examples that I have is the spirit of Persephone. You can see the painting right above me here. This is a spirit of space and time, but also a spirit of creativity that has played a significant role in my magical life. I've been working with Persephone for almost 30 years now, to kind of give you an idea. Because I've been practicing magic for 32 years. I've worked with spirits for the entire time. I started working with Persephone a long, long time ago. Now, Persephone is a quote-unquote goetic daemon. And I essentially have a relationship with Persephone where I'm interacting with him in one form or another every single day. And that's actually kind of the relationship I have with spirits in general. I have my home set up as a space for the spirits that I've invited in to regularly connect with me. Now, a lot of people don't approach demonic magic that way, or demonic spirit work that way, and a lot of people just don't approach spirit work that way at all. I'm going to call a spirit up on the occasion that I need it, and then I'm going to send it out into the world to go and get something and do something for me, or I'm going to get some information from it, and then I'm going to send it on its way. And let me be clear, there is a really good reason to sometimes do magical rituals and close those loops up. But I think in terms of having a relationship with the spirit, it's a bit of a different thing. I'm not just necessarily working with the spirit for the purposes of doing practical magic work or getting information. Rather, I am choosing to form an intentional relationship where the spirit and I are in a constant dialogue, and there is a inspiration going back and forth. And that inspiration going back and forth allows us to connect with each other in really deep and meaningful ways and creates an ongoing transmission. So this is something that that I do talk about more in advanced spirit communication, but it's the idea behind how spirits work. So Jonathan says, there's a lot of resources nowadays for finding spirits to work. For example, if you want inspiration for a song, you have a vast selection to choose from. How do you know what to choose that will work best? Do you recommend some? Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, aside from the fact that I am going to recommend my books and my classes, because I actually have the Walking with Spirits series, and I have a couple of pre-recorded classes that I've taught, and then of course I have a live class that I do every so often, which is Advanced Spirit Communication. So those are resources I'm going to recommend. I mean, I think another resource that I would really recommend is anything by Stephanie Connolly, who's a really good friend of mine. I really respect her work when it comes to like demonic magic and her approach to spirits in general. When I first started out, one of the first books that I read was How to Work with Spirit Guides by Ted Andrews. And then I read his Nature, Spirits, and Elemental books. And I still have those books to this day. Like I still have them over 30 years later, and I still look at them occasionally. So, I think his work's pretty solid. There's some good stuff out there by Ivo Dominguez Jr. as well on the topic of spirit work. So, I mean, part of it though is really kind of just use your own best judgment and think about it from the perspective of like, does this person's approach to spirit work make sense to me? And one of the things that I teach people in general with magical work is how to personalize their magical work. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that you make it your own. So the way that I do magical work may not fully work for you, but that doesn't mean you can learn something from me. And in fact, I think it's a really important thing to recognize that there a lot of times you can learn from somebody and take like what they share and come up with your own system of spiritual work. I think that this is an important aspect that we often kind of gloss over. Like we're like, oh, I picked up a book and I got to do it the way that person says to do it. Well, not necessarily. Now I will say that I firmly believe that there should be a strong foundation in magical work. Like, I didn't start experimenting as soon as I started practicing magic. Okay. I started practicing magic and I spent the first 2 years where I read books. And for the most part, I did exactly what was, like I did the rituals and the spells and the ceremonies and all that other stuff the way that the authors presented it. There was a certain need to just learn that information and get a feel for it. And then like when I was 18 years old, I was like, nah, I can start experimenting with this stuff. And I started to look for what I called the gaps, the things that didn't quite make sense to me. And I started to answer for myself the questions that I had, like about spirit work, about magic in general. But I had 2 years of daily experience at that point because I'd worked with magic every day. And I will also say that I'm probably atypical for a lot of people. Like when I commit to something, I really commit to it. As my beloved and magical partner has found out, like it's like when I say that I'm going to do something, I take action right away. Like she knows that I'm going to follow through and do something if I say I'm going to do it. And that's a really important thing. Like with our magical work, with our relationships, with anything, is like if you say you're going to do it, then do it. Commit to it. Really commit to it, because it's easy to say something. It's the actions you take that matter. Those actions speak louder than any words you could possibly offer. And so it's the same thing with this magical work. So I laid down a very specific foundation. I learned a lot about elemental magic, hermeticism, neo-shamanic practices. I started learning Golden Dawn ceremonial magic for a bit, and then I moved on to other things. And that helped to set the foundation. It helped me figure out what didn't work and what did work. Hi there, John. Looks like we have another person who just joined us. John, just to let you know, we are I'm doing a live Q&A about spirit work. If you have a question, feel free to write a message and share that in your share that here. We are getting some great questions here. Sheena just said, in your space-time magic class, you had us choose a space-time spirit And it was so fascinating. One person chose a saint. I found that once I opened up and said what I wanted, synchronicities pointed to a specific spirit became obvious. And through the process, I got to learn how they like to communicate. And hi, John. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying hello. Yeah, Sheena, that's like a great example. And thank you again for attending my Space Time Magic class. I've actually had you in a couple of my classes at this point. You're also in my Advanced Inner Alchemy of Life course, and also in the most recent Magical Experiments Challenge. So I really appreciate you you showing up for this as well. And I hope to see you in the Advanced Spirit Magic Communication course. So you said that, so I kind of want to go back. You said that you'd open up and said what I wanted, synchronicities pointed to a specific spirit became obvious, and you got to learn how they like to communicate. So I'm kind of curious, Shana, and feel free to kind of drop a note in here. Like, what did you learn about how they like to communicate? Or what did you learn about that process? I'm gonna speak to this a little bit while you're typing that out, maybe. And here's the thing. A lot of times we have this really preconceived idea as to how spirits communicate. We have these expectations. So the expectation is that the spirits are going to communicate in a certain way, like the spirits are going to appear in a visible form, right? Or they're going to show up like with a human shape, or they're going to talk in our language, or things along those lines. And a lot of times, what actually stops people from effectively communicating with spirits is that they don't pay attention to the subtleties of spirit communication. I'm not saying that I've never ever had a spirit appear, like through visualization, for example, in a form that I could make sense of. And I'm not even saying that I've never ever had a spirit communicate in the English language. I've had that happen. But what I found is that as I have gotten more and more adept at letting go of my own expectations around how spirits ought to appear or how they ought to communicate, I've actually had a lot more meaningful and deeper communication with spirits. I've had what I would call spiritual transmission, where essentially the spirit is transmitting its knowledge and its wisdom to me. And in the process, it's allowing me to connect meaningfully with it and with its essence. And something to remember about spirits, and we're going to go into this a lot more in advanced spirit communication, is that spirits essentially represent and mediate specific forces, knowledge, influence, etc. So when we're communicating with them, we're connecting with that influence or that wisdom and that knowledge, and we're learning how to, the spirit is essentially mediating it so that we can handle the amount of information that we're getting. We can handle that specific spiritual influence. So as an example, if I'm working with the element of fire, right? The element of fire could burn me out if I work with it directly. But if I have an elemental that I'm working with, that elemental can mediate that fiery energy for me and allow me to connect with the right amount of energy that I could connect with, and the right amount of information that I can then put through into magical work. And that's one of the functions and forms of spirits. They mediate the energy, they mediate the essence, they mediate the knowledge and the wisdom. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind in regards to spirit work. All right. So folks, I want to encourage you that if you have any questions or comments to drop those in while you got me here. I'm going to be on here for as long as I've got questions. And then after that, I'll close up. I do have a class that I'm attending at 7:30 for the Evolutionary Collective. So I will be wrapping up before then because I want to be at that. But if you have something that you want to share or questions that you have, this is a great time to ask those questions. And while you're doing it, I'm going to drop in a link here for the Advanced Spirit Communication class. Sheena said, it was primarily through time perception distortions, stretching and compression moments of how I interpret time. Took me a bit of time to figure it out. I like that. It took me a bit of time to figure it out. That is funny. Well, yeah, I mean, this is a great example of working with a spirit, right? A spirit is going to communicate through what it mediates and what it represents. So if we're talking about like time perception, and distortions, that stretching and that compression of time, it's going to give you an experience. It's going to communicate to you through the sense of time. Oh, hey, Dave. Welcome to the broadcast here. And Dave, just to kind of fill you in, I'm doing a live Q&A session about spirits. And so if you have questions about how to work with spirits, how to communicate with spirits, feel free to drop those in. We've already had a few questions. John just asked a question as well. He said, can't all these spiritual, quote unquote, entities be considered archetypal? I don't think so, really. And there's a good reason for that. I see the importance of archetypes. I mean, that's definitely a Jungian psychological concept. But really, my own experience of spirits has been that there is a lot more depth and reality and presence to them that goes beyond the archetype. I see the value of doing archetypal work, but I don't conflate archetypal work with spirit work. So, for example, I do a lot of men's work. And men's work, one of the things that we end up doing is we work with the archetypes of the king, the warrior, the lover, the magician. And those are very convenient interfaces for working with specific versions of quote unquote masculine energy. Although really, we could also say that those same archetypes apply to the feminine as well, if we're going to really be honest here. But for the purposes of just this, we're working with a specific, if you will, a specific interface that allows us to connect with that type of perspective or that energy in a certain way. Spirits, though, have their own identities, their own essence, their own being. They may mediate some spiritual forces, but those spiritual forces in and of themselves are much more than just an archetype. And so, for example, Sheena's example of working with time, like a time spirit, and feeling and having that time spirit communicate with her through distortions of time, through contraction and expansion of time, is a good example of really connecting with something that goes far beyond an archetypal experience. Time is not necessarily an archetypical experience. We might work with time from an archetype perspective, like old man time. We could work with that and kind of, coming to grips with our mortality and coming to grips with something along those lines. But time distortions are something much more real than just that. And I kind of liken it to this way: like when if I work with a spirit and I'm getting that spirit to help me produce very tangible results in my life, I know it's something more than just a psychological concept. In my own magical work, one of the things that I really emphasize is the importance of, bringing in non-occult disciplines and integrating them into magical work. And sometimes I do that with psychological models. And that can be really handy for providing a kind of a perspective on how magic works. And at the same time, the one mistake I don't make that I sometimes see people make is they'll kind of take it and they'll be like, that explains everything about how magic works. I don't do that. It provides a perspective, and it can be a useful framework, and the model is not the territory. As cliched as that may sound, there we go. So that's just something to remember and keep in mind. Now I'm going to drop into the chat here, and I'm going to kind of pull my phone here a little bit closer. So I'm going to drop into the chat here the link to the class, and then I will answer Jonathan's question here. So just give me one moment. And so if you are interested in this class that I have coming up, it's starting in 2 weeks on the 25th of February, and we are going to be exploring the practice of working with spirits. We're going to be doing it over 6 weeks, and each week we're going to be working with a different type of spirit. The other thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be offering one coaching session where it's just going to be you and me working one-on-one together. So if you had questions or anything like that about the class or something else, we actually have that. That's one of the bonuses. And one of the other bonuses is I'm going to be offering an autographed copy of Walking with Demonic Spirits. And this is going to be an exclusive bonus this time around. So I just dropped the link into there. I'll have it on the post later on. Okay, so Jonathan asked, do you use a more traditional approach when banishing like LBRP or angels, or do you prefer elemental banishing before performing evocation? I think I need to use something like an elemental banishing since I tend to associate angels with monotheism, like the Judeo-Christian God. Well, one, I don't associate angels with the Judeo-Christian God. I know that that can be the case, but I also think there's at least enough evidence that angels have been in at least some other traditions and practices. And also, I just don't really get overly attached to the angels being associated with a specific deity or not. That's one thing. When I do the sphere of art, essentially what I am doing is I am, for all intents and purposes, clearing my space out of that which does not belong, which includes any spiritual forces that, or anything else that ought not to be there. Any psychic influences, any magical influences that I don't want to have in the environment with me. And then I invite in. So that's essentially what I do. It's not necessarily banishing so much as it's kind of like a purification of sorts. But it's also an attunement to that which belongs with me. And I use that practice because I found that kind of to be the best way to kind of approach this spirit work. And what's interesting is that with it, I'm actually calling in and working with archangels to set the framework of that container. And at the same time, like I'm calling in demonic spirits afterwards, you know, or I have demonic spirits in my environment, and there's no conflict there, or like for example, like I have my patron deities of my household, which is Eros and Aphrodite and Kronos, or aka Saturn. And again, I've never had any issues with having that kind of work in terms of you know, like the archangels or anything like that. So I think a huge part of it is deprogramming your religious beliefs a lot of the time. And I will admit that like sometimes people will come into this and have religious beliefs that get in the way. Hi, Mason. Welcome to the live show here. I'm doing a Q&A where I'm answering questions about spirits, spirit work, and communication in regards to so if you have any questions about those, feel free to drop them in. I will be wrapping this up sometime soon here, just because I have another class I'm going to be getting ready for. But if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in. I've also answered a few of them so far. So what I would say, Jonathan, is like one thing to really kind of look at maybe is also just like kind of exploring like how much of this is me holding on to a specific, you know, like being raised a certain way. It's interesting because there's an author, I don't really agree with him, but Joseph Lizowski, who ended up writing a bit about like evocation and ceremonial magic. And he made the argument that you had to do evocation magic using the religious system that you were brought up with. So if you were brought up as a Christian, then you had to do it within that framework. And let me just be clear here. I was raised as an Episcopalian, you know, basically Church of England Christian, and then I became a born again Christian for a while, and then I got out of all that and got into magic. I've never ever had to use the Christian deity or anything like that, and my choice to use the archangels has a lot more to do with Kabbalistic associations and the choice to like work with the archangels from that Kabbalistic perspective. Again, I've never really felt a need to draw on you know, like the Christian perspective of it, and I don't feel like it really gets in the way of like my work with Eros and Aphrodite and Kronos or anything along those lines. But again, a huge part of it, or the demonic spirits, a huge part of it is the way you orient yourself to it. And I've had over 30 years at this point of like really not caring one way or another. So that may be an advantage that I have in my case. All right, folks. So if you have any questions, I will be on here for a couple more minutes at least. But if you have any questions, like now's a good time to drop those in, and I'm more than happy to answer them. I'm super excited because, as I said, in 2 weeks, advanced spirit communication is occurring. Aha. Yeah, Sheena said, you said daemons are wisdom and angels tend to be more function. Can you explain that quickly? Yes, I can. More than happy to for you, Sheena. So, when we talk about demonic spirits, when I talk about demonic spirits as being spirits of wisdom, I'm kind of referring to that root word of daemon, which in Greek it basically represents that spirit of wisdom. But part of it is also kind of in working with spirits. What I found is that there is kind of a specific experience of the spirit. So what I find is that demonic spirits tend to have a bit more personality than angels do, for lack of a better word, and they very much are rooted in kind of what they represent. So, for example, if I work with the goetic daemon Marcosius, Marcosius is very much rooted around like that energy of the warrior energy. He's not necessarily like an archetype, but he's very much like a fighter. So if I'm going to work with him, like I find like working with him with martial arts, for example, there's that bit of a personality around it that shows up. Now I compare that to like Archangel Camiel, and Camiel is an archangel that is very much about kind of like justice and everything else. But Archangel Camiel is very much focused around like a very kind of like just like a very stark definition of justice, and that's the function and the way that Camiel works. It's kind of interesting because in a very real sense, if I come into if I come into working with an archangel or an angel and it's function based, that angel, as long as I'm working within the context of the function, it doesn't really care. It'll work with me. If I'm coming at it though from a place that's like counter to its function, that's when that angel will kind of respond and react, and not usually in a way that's favorable. So I always recommend, if you're going to work with angels, know what their function is. On the other hand, if I am working like with a daemon, I find that there is a bit more versatility. The daemons are a lot more flexible in terms of how they work. And that's actually why, in general, I would say that when I do a lot of my spirit work, I tend to work with daemons. I do some work with angels. Obviously, I call in and work with the archangels every day. So there is some of that going on there. But I just think it's kind of a fascinating example of like where there's some difference, as it were. Between those spirits. I don't know if that answered your question or not, Sheena, but that was certainly the goal there. Hopefully it did. John said, people who have deconstructed their former Christian beliefs probably won't use the faith traditions that they were raised with in their magical practices. Well, that's what I found. I mean, I deconstructed mine and I really don't use them. And I've seen that with other people as well. All right. And I had another question here. Dave said, have you ever found yourself surprised to be working with an entity? No, not really. Only because when I work with, I'm very intentional about how I work with entities. I think that if somebody finds themselves surprised to be working with an entity, it's probably because they've attracted that entity in some way, in some way, shape, or form. So I'll use the classic example of like the succubus or the incubus, which are basically sexual spirits. If you're not if you're not quote unquote careful with your sexual energy, you can tend to basically attract what would be energetic parasites. So a succubus or an incubus would be an example of that. They're basically trying to steal your life energy. On the one hand, it might be pleasurable. On the other hand, you've essentially working with them in a way that you maybe weren't planning for. And this kind of goes back to the point I made to Jonathan earlier about why you want to do some kind of daily practice where, for all intents and purposes, you're purifying yourself and setting your intention in what you are bringing in. So I've never found myself working with a spirit that I didn't actually intentionally choose. Okay, let's see. I got another question here. Thank you, guys. I love the questions that are coming in here. Do you perform evocations in a physical draw a circle in the ground approach or a more astral way? And do you work to get into a trance state before performing evocation? Oh, this is a great question because I actually don't do evocation the way that pretty much everyone else does. I have a very unique process for doing evocation. I don't draw a circle on the ground and do a triangle like most people do. And I don't do astral evocations either. What I do with evocation is I actually set up what I call evocation portals. And I'll be going into this in the Advanced Spirit Communication class in detail and showing you how to do it. But the evocation portal essentially is a permanent portal that I create that allows me to call forth the spirit at any time and work with it without having to go and do the laborious work every time that someone else has to do. I've never found that classical evocation practices have worked all that well, and I don't think they do work all that well. There's a reason why people continually come into online occult communities and say, I tried to evoke a spirit and get it to appear before me and it didn't, or I tried to get it to communicate, or I evoked a spirit and then it burned my house to the ground. Yes, true story that, by the way. There was somebody who was working with a goetic daemon and that spirit ended up burning their house to the ground because they weren't careful. But part of that was because they were being coercive about it. Like they were like, oh, okay, I'm going to call the spirit up and smack it around and force it to do something. You know, like really, if you think about it, nobody wants to be coerced. Why would we think that spirits want that either? It's such a common sense answer. And yet I see time and again, most of these books on spirit work, it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to call the spirit up and force it to do something. It kind of brings out the worst in humanity when you think about it. And that's not the approach that I really want to apply towards spirit work, or really that I would want to apply with anybody. So just something to keep in mind. So really, and in terms of getting into a trance state, yes, I do end up getting into a trance state when I'm doing spirit work. You know, tomorrow night, actually, for those of you who are here, and for those of you who watch this later, I'm going to be doing a full moon ritual where I will actually be doing some scrying work with Aphrodite. And I will be broadcasting that live on here. You're welcome to join in and take part in that if you want, and just to see some of the work that I'm doing and how that works. My beloved will be kind of a silent partner for that. She'll be present, but you won't necessarily see her because she's going to be on Zoom since it's long distance, but she's going to also be part of that. So I'm super excited about that. And we're going to be doing a full moon ritual. So it's going to be pretty dynamic because we're going to be working with the full moon, but we're going to be really working with the idea of working with Aphrodite and working with that Venusian attraction energy. You know, an attraction energy works in many different ways. It's not just about attracting someone as a lover. It can come in many different forms. And I'll talk a little bit about that during the live presentation to I'll set kind of the tone for everything. And so that'll be an example of like a practical spirit work. So folks, I want to thank you. I'm gonna hop off here. I appreciate all the questions. And I really appreciate all of you being on here. I am going to be doing live broadcasts like this on a fairly regular basis, so that you'll be seeing me kind of come on here regularly, because I think this is a great way for me to interact with you and answer questions. And again, if you get a chance, check out Advanced Spirit Communication. It is starting in 2 weeks. You're going to get a lot of amazing bonuses. You're getting a one-on-one session with me, which is amazing because you're getting an hour of just dedicated you and me time talking about whatever you're working with. You're getting the Advanced Spirit Communication class, and you're getting a lot of other awesome things, an autographed copy of Walking with Demonic Spirits. So thank you all so much and have an excellent evening. Take care.